We're recording. Okay, perfect. Hello. So last time we started talking about the topic of sexual consent, right? And the question was, is consent sufficient for a sexual action to be morally permissible? Okay, just about everybody has thought, or at least all serious philosophers have thought, that consent was necessary for sex to be morally permissible, right? If you don't have consent, it's not morally permissible. But the big question that we're talking about now is it also sufficient, right? Is it the case that whenever it's consensual, well, it's also morally permissible? We saw near the end of our lectures on Kant that although Kant himself does not think this, okay, Kant himself, um, we saw his views about sex are in many ways a product of his time and don't really fit with his own theory. Um, Contemporary Kantians, philosophers who work on ethics now and who are more or less or who more or less accept Kant's normative ethical theory, think that that consent is sufficient for the permissibility of a sexual act. Okay, as long as the parties are rational, right? So it's got to be rational consent. As long as there's no conditions that are making the consent forced, right? As long as there's no deception or manipulation, then consent is sufficient for sex to be permissible. And what we're going to see today, and what we started seeing last time, is that most contemporary utilitarians think something similar. Okay, maybe not all, but a lot of them do. The thing, though, is that they're going to say this for very different reasons. Okay, so some contemporary utilitarians are going to say that it is morally permissible, or rather that consent is sufficient to make an action morally permissible, to make a sexual act morally permissible, but they're going to say this for very different reasons. Okay, the justification is going to be very different. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to keep talking about utilitarianism and on liberty, right? These two short books of Mill's that are usually published together or often published together. Now we're going to move on to the on liberty part of it. And we're going to see the harm principle that is at the heart of Mill's book on liberty and at the heart of his understanding of how society should be run. Um, and we'll see how the harm principle leads to a kind of ethic of consent. Okay, not only in sexual matters, but also in sexual matters. And this will involve explaining the distinction that he makes between the public sphere and the private sphere. Then, once we're done talking about that, we're going to, as always, do a bit of an analysis of the text that we just read. And as always, I'll talk about the sexual ethic that comes out of Mill's work and the sexual metaphysics, the view of what the sexual instinct is or what it's like that he seems to take for granted. Okay. And then that'll finish our topic on sexual consent. And next time, we're going to move on to our very last topic, which is sexual repression. Okay. So last time, we started talking about utilitarianism and on liberty. And we specifically spend our time talking about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, the book, right? The book by John Stuart Mill called Utilitarianism, but also utilitarianism, the normative ethical theory. Utilitarianism is one of the two most prominent, I think, normative ethical theories in Western philosophy since the modern period. And as we saw last time, what utilitarianism says is that the right thing to do is to produce the most happiness overall. Okay, I'm not going to go through this again, but I kind of explain the kind of cost-benefit analysis that this involves, and the way in which utilitarians think that we need to select which social institutions to put in place, which social norms to enforce, which virtues to inculcate in our children, things like this. And so this is a question about ethics. Utilitarianism is a theory about ethics, and the question is, what, ethically speaking, is the right thing to do? We saw utilitarianism is a combination of two theories. On the one hand, there's consequentialism, right? The view that what makes an action right or wrong is that it brings about the most good consequences, right? Or brings about the best consequences. But that, of course, doesn't tell you yet what consequences are good, right? You need to supplement consequentialism with a view of the good. Consequentialism on its own doesn't tell you what things are good. And so you have to supplement it. And utilitarianism adds to the consequentialist framework the theory of hedonism. And the theory of hedonism we saw is the theory that the only intrinsic good is pleasure. Everything else that is good instrumentally. So we saw this as a humanist ethic, right? Unlike medieval ethics, this one is one that's centered around human well-being and actually not just human well-being. It's also a secular ethic, right? It's an attempt to ground ethics, morality, without appealing to religious premises. And again, although it's primarily an ethical theory, this is also going to give us a criterion for selecting which institutions to put in place. Okay, so it's going to have some relevance for politics. And historically speaking, like utilitarians were in many ways very socially progressive. Okay, so utilitarians like John Stuart Mill were at the forefront of the fight for women's rights, women's equality in the 19th century. At the forefront also of the abolitionist movement to put an end to slavery. And utilitarians have also been very prominent advocates for legalizing same-sex relations in the 20th century, and then now are very strong advocates for animal welfare, for extending more rights to non-human animals. So it's they tend to be very socially progressive in their political orientation. And this brings me to the political side of things. We talked last time about liberalism. Liberalism is not primarily an ethical theory. It's a theory about politics. How should we order society? How should we order our political institutions? And the liberal idea is that political institutions should promote individual freedoms. Okay, one way to understand this that I talked about last time is that individual citizens should have the most freedom that is compatible with the same freedom for everybody else. And this is not quite how Mill's going to defend it, but that's a very common way to put the liberal ideal. And this book on liberty that we're going to talk about now is a defense of liberalism in politics, though as you'll see, it also has some ethical implications. So it's a defense of what's often called the liberal freedoms, okay? Things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, economic freedom, freedom of conscience, right, or freedom of religion, freedom of worship, those kinds of things. And you'll see that in Mill, the liberal political orientation, and so his idea about how we should organize society or how we should organize our political institutions also involves an ethic of consent. Okay, so he thinks this has some ethical implications. Okay, so Mill begins on liberty with a question. The excerpt that you read begins with a question, and he says, what is the proper relationship between authority and liberty? In the past, he says, the question was about the proper relationship between the authority of a ruler, right, like a king, something like that, and the individual and the liberty of individual citizens. But now we're into the 19th century. As we've seen, there's been a process of secularization. There's also been the rise of a humanist ethic, and along with all that, a push toward more and more democratic societies. Okay, so increasingly, people, not everybody, but increasingly people think that society should reflect the will of the governed. Okay, so what laws we have in place, who represents us politically, should represent the will of the people. And so the way that Mill poses the question is he says, okay, what is the correct relationship then between the authority of the masses, right, not of a king or a ruler, but the authority of the majority and the liberty of individuals, meaning here of minorities? To what degree can a majority impose its preferences on individual citizens who do not share those preferences? Okay, that is Mill's question. Here is what he comes up with. Okay, here's what he defends anyway, his view of this relationship. Here's a quotation, comes from what I had you read near the very beginning. He says, the object of this essay, the purpose of this essay on liberty, is to assert one very simple principle: as entitled to government absolutely, sorry, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties, or the moral coercion of public opinion. This is going to come back, but notice he's talking about two different kinds of compulsion here, two different kinds of control, two different ways you can force someone to do something. And he says, with regard to both of these ways, there's one principle that we should follow. That principle, he says, is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any other, is self-protection. It is only for self-protection that we may interfere with the actions of another person. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This is what, in the literature on John Stuart Mill, is called the harm principle. The only purpose for which you can coerce someone, right? The only purpose for which you can use physical force or moral coercion to prevent someone from doing something is to prevent harm to others. That's the harm principle. What does this mean? Well, if you think someone is going to harm themselves, okay, at least within certain limits, okay, Mill actually goes on to qualify this a little bit. But if somebody being fully rational, being undeceived, wants to do something, and you think it will be against their interest, okay, it's going to harm them in some way, Mill thinks this is not an appropriate instance in which to use either physical force or moral coercion to prevent them from doing it. Okay? Only if it's going to harm other people, or if there's good reason to think it's going to harm other people. So this is what you might call an anti-paternalistic view, primarily of government, but also, of social norms or of ethics. Paternalism, by the way, is simply preventing people from doing things, usually the government preventing people from doing things for their own good. Okay, so the most obvious example of like a paternalistic restriction that we all accept is seatbelts. Okay, seatbelts are not there to prevent us from harming other people. They're there to prevent us from harming ourselves. Okay, so it is a paternalistic policy that we must wear seatbelts. Any policy like that that is designed to prevent you from hurting yourself is paternalistic. And the thrust of Mill's harm principle is an anti-paternalistic understanding of what the state can do, right, of political power, and of what we can do, or what we should do in trying to force each other or compel each other to do certain things. Right? We should not employ either the power of the state, the political power of the state, or the social power of moral coercion to prevent people from harming themselves, only from harming others. So notice, this doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. Okay? If I think that you're about to do something that's bad for you, suppose you want to take up smoking, and you're an adult, right? You're not like my child or something. You're an adult, you want to take up smoking. Of course, I can argue with you. I can give you statistics for why this is probably a very bad idea. I can try to dissuade you. I can express my disappointment with you if you go ahead and do it anyway. Okay? All those things are fine. And actually, it might be good for me to do all those things. I can prevent some harm. What I can't do, Mill thinks, is one, use the government to prevent you from smoking, right? Try to pass a law so that you're not allowed to smoke anymore. Again, assuming that you're an adult. Or try to make it impossible for you to smoke without harming your interests significantly. So, for example, organize with other shop owners in the town so that we refuse to serve smokers, discriminate against you actively, that kind of thing, ostracize you socially, refuse to do anything with you, try to get you fired because you're smoking, right? These kinds of things. So these are the two kinds of coercion that Mill is talking about. On the one hand, there's physical force, meaning here, passing a law such that if you break it, the police is going to come to your place or fine you or jail you or that kind of thing. But the other one, which is just as important, is moral coercion. Okay? The various ways in which we're able to exert pressure on people socially, even when there isn't a law in place, right? Again, by refusing to serve you, discriminating against you, by firing you, all these kinds of ways in which we're able to do this. He thinks that the only places where that is justifiable is where you're harming others, not just yourself. Okay, so what Mill is saying is that an action causing harm to others is necessary to coerce them out of doing it. Again, in both these ways, both politically speaking and socially speaking. What does that mean? Well, if an action does not harm anybody, then the question about whether we should try to prevent others from doing it just doesn't arise. It would be unjustified for sure to try to prevent them from doing it. But that doesn't mean um, that harm to others is a sufficient condition for using coercion. Okay, so in other words, it doesn't mean that whenever an action harms others, it's okay to use coercion to prevent them from doing it. So if an action does not harm anybody, again, the question doesn't arise. We don't even ask, should we try to stop them from doing this? If an action does or can harm someone, now we ask, okay, should we put a law in place here, or should we do something socially to try to prevent people from doing it? Right? So now the question arises. That's not the same thing as saying now we prevent them from doing it. Now we have to ask, do we have good enough reasons to prevent them from doing it? And how are we supposed to decide this? Well, think about our cost benefit analysis last time. Right? The question is, okay, is it going to produce more harm than good if we prevent people from doing this, even though it harms some people? Okay? Because there are plenty of things you may do that will harm some people, but bring about a lot more benefit overall, right? And so the question then, if it does harm someone, if some action does harm someone, the question to ask is, do the benefits outweigh those harms? Okay, so there's got to be a trade-off. There's got to be a cost-benefit analysis. You got to do the math, right, to figure out what's most beneficial overall. Now, this might puzzle you. Right? You might be wondering what kind of action could harm someone but still be in the overall benefit. Well, most of the actions that are covered by liberal freedoms, right? But by the kinds of liberties that liberal political theorists have been concerned about. Think about economic freedom. Okay, so if we have economic freedom and I can start whatever business I want, and I can trade with whoever I want, well, some people are going to get harmed. Some people are going to go bankrupt. I'm going to start an enterprise and then I'll go bankrupt. And then, that'll be stressful, cause me maybe not to be able to provide for myself, for my family for a bit, have to take out a loan, whatever. It might be difficult for me. It'll harm me and a few other people. But it'll be much better overall if we can all start businesses than if there's like a government monopoly, right? Where the government um, only allows a certain number of people to pursue some kind of business, prevent others. It's going to be in the overall interest if anybody can start a business and try to compete in the marketplace such that they're providing, better goods or the same goods at a better price and so on. Everybody will benefit, or there will be overall benefit in that case. Similarly, if you've got a free market, you've got economic freedom, well, sometimes people will lose their jobs, right? So as we innovate, some jobs will go obsolete, right? 500, 600 years ago, there were lots of blacksmiths. Now there are no blacksmiths. We don't really need those anymore for the most part, right? Some jobs are going to go obsolete, and so some people are going to lose their jobs. Some enterprises are going to go bankrupt, and people are going to get laid off. That's going to be harmful for them, right? So you're causing some harm there. But again, it's by far in the overall benefit that we have the kind of economy that's able to accommodate innovation than if we're forced to remain stagnant in the Middle Ages for all of eternity. Okay, so that's one example, economic freedom. Another one is free speech, right? So if people have free speech, well, there's all kinds of ways in which people will be harmed. It can be very stressful, very, very distressing to have your beliefs challenged, or to hear somebody tell you that they think your religion is false, or that your ideology is false, whatever. Sure, that can harm some people, but it is by far more beneficial that we're able to criticize people's ideas than not, right? That we're able to challenge people's ideas than not. If you compare to the medieval period, for example, when people did not have economic freedom, to when people did not have freedom of speech, the jump in well-being is astounding. Okay, suddenly people live much better lives, like a much higher quality of life. Suddenly, during the modern period, better ideas start to surface, and people are able to, and they're able to win out, basically, right, in the market of ideas. The better ideas survive, and the worse ideas get criticized to oblivion. So even though it does cause some harm, right, some people get offended, some people maybe feel very lost because they now come to think that religion is false or something like that. It is in everybody's overall benefit. Okay, so that's how Mill is thinking about it. If it doesn't harm anybody, then the question about whether we should regulate it politically or socially, just doesn't arise. It's none of our business. If it does harm somebody, okay, now we have to figure out, um, do the benefits of allowing people to do this thing that can harm someone outweigh the harms or not? Okay? If they do outweigh the harms, then we should still allow it. Okay? So we shouldn't regulate it. If they don't outweigh the harms, that's when it's justified to use social or political coercion. Okay? So this means, again, harming others is necessary for us to start talking about whether we should regulate it. But it's not sufficient to regulate it. Okay? That's not enough. It's not enough to know, oh, this action harms somebody, to decide, okay, we should regulate it. We should prevent somebody from doing this. So what do you get out of this? Well, basically, what you might call a liberal social ethic. Okay? Anything that doesn't harm others, they should be socially allowed. People should be socially allowed to do. Okay? We should tolerate it. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't disapprove. It doesn't mean that you can't criticize. It doesn't mean you can't try to dissuade. But you cannot try to force. Okay? You need to tolerate it. You need to tolerate speech that you disagree with. You need to tolerate lifestyles that you disagree with. Okay? So again, the justification here is utilitarian. Okay, so in most utilitarian theories, you'll see this, where there's kind of like two levels going on. On the one hand, there's the fundamental level, which is a criterion of what makes an action right or wrong. Okay, what makes things right or wrong is whether they maximize well-being. And that's sort of like the ground level of any utilitarian theory. But then, of course, there's a further question, which is, okay, what should we be doing at any given moment? And just about nobody thinks that what we should be doing is sitting there and trying to calculate all the effects of any one of our actions. Perform that kind of cost-benefit analysis at every moment of the day. Like, what if I were to start doing this right now? I'd be like, okay, well, it would provide some benefit to my students if I kept lecturing, but surely somebody in Montreal is in need of help somewhere right now. Maybe I should run out and try to find them and just suspend this lecture. What you should be doing at any given moment is not frantically trying to find the most beneficial thing you could possibly do, because in fact, doing that would not be the most beneficial thing, right? If everybody were doing that, what would result is just utter chaos. And so there's a second level, which is, okay, what set of rules, what set of principles, what set of values, virtues should govern our everyday behavior? Okay? And the set of rules we're going to pick, as we saw last time, is going to be whichever one we think maximizes well-being overall. Okay, so utilitarians don't say, there's no room for virtues here. They don't say there's no room for rules. They just say, well, virtues and rules are ultimately justified by what's in the overall good. Okay, so the correct rules are going to be the ones that bring about the most happiness overall. And so what Mill is saying is the harm principle, right? Tolerating any action that doesn't harm anybody is justified on utilitarian grounds. This is the kind of social ethic that will lead to the best consequences overall. Okay, so that's the relationship between the utilitarianism that we saw last time and the liberalism that we're seeing now. Mill thinks that this kind of liberal social ethic and also liberal political ethic is what's going to maximize human well-being. Now, what I want to point out is this leads to a certain view of society, a certain view of different spheres, I guess you could say, of social activity, which traditionally is called the private sphere and the public sphere. Okay, so I've got a long quote here for you. Mill says, there is a sphere of action in which society, as distinguished from the individual, has, if any, only an indirect interest. Okay, so there's a sphere of society that he's isolating here. That sphere, he says, comprehends all that portion of a person's life and conduct which affect only himself, or, if it also affects others, only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. Okay, so there's a sphere of activity where only you and whoever voluntarily does stuff with you are affected. This we could call the private sphere. Okay, this is the sphere of action that is private in the sense that it's a sphere of government non-interference. That's what it means to say, to talk about the private sphere, is it's a sphere of action where the government, or in this case also, where society does not interfere with what you want to do. So if the only people affected are people who are voluntarily doing something, it's none of anybody else's business. Okay, so as long as the consent, as he says here, is free, voluntary, right? It's not being forced or anything like that, and it's undeceived, it's not under false pretenses, then what people do together is none of anybody else's business. So, of course, here with this criterion of rationality, children are excluded, right? And he says so explicitly. That's a different case. We're only talking about people who are rational enough to have a pretty good idea of what is in their own self-interest, right? What their good is. But as long as people are rational, then just let people regulate their activity between themselves is the idea. Okay, to get back to the kinds of liberties that liberals usually emphasize. Think about the domain of trade. Again, during the medieval period, there were a lot of restrictions on who you could do business with. But liberals like Mill think, look, if any private individual wants to conduct business with any other private individual, right, or if any firm wants to conduct business with any other firm, whatever, that is none of anybody else's business. Okay, that is simply between the contracting parties. Again, as long as there's no deception or anything like that involved. Similarly, during the Middle Ages, as we saw, church and state were very, very closely connected. Right? They were intertwined. For a long time, if you lived in a Catholic country, well, during the Middle Ages, just everybody was Catholic. But during the early modern period, if you lived in a country where the king was Catholic, well, you had to be Catholic or leave. If you lived in a country where the king was Lutheran, that's a kind of Protestant Christian. And well, you had to be one or leave, and so on and so forth. Okay. Whereas here, liberals like Mill are saying, no, let individuals figure out their religious beliefs. And if they can find other people who have similar beliefs or convince other people of their beliefs, well, let them contract with each other and form a church. Whatever. That is none of anybody else's business. Okay, they have the freedom to do that. Now, here's where finally the sexual ethics comes in. Mill doesn't actually talk about sex at all explicitly, but here is where concerns about or questions about sexual ethics come in. He says, this principle requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to such consequences as may follow, without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as what we do does not harm them, even though they think our conduct foolish, perverse, or wrong. So what's the idea here? Well, people are different. Okay, people differ from each other. Now, of course, most of us overlap in most ways. Okay, most of us want lives that are pretty, like relatively speaking, pretty similar. But there are differences between people, and some people fall way outside the norm. And what Mill thinks is, well, we're going to be better off if those people who fall a little bit or a lot outside the norm can just try to find whatever lifestyle works for them. Okay, so normal arrangements, which historically speaking is like in the sexual domain, we can talk about long-term monogamous heterosexual relationships. Those work for most, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so those people, well, should have the freedom to pursue their tastes or preferences or preferred lifestyles. So they have the freedom to contract with other people, enter into voluntary agreements with them that each person thinks is in their own good, right? Remember, a contract from our lectures on Kant is an agreement that two people enter into, usually for their own good, right? They give up certain things in order to gain certain things, reciprocally operating under the idea that it will be in the overall good for each of them. And so Mill thinks you should be free, right? People should be free to seek each other out or seek out people who have preferences like them and enter into whatever voluntary agreements they want to with them. And that is, again, none of anybody else's business as long as it doesn't harm anybody. as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. Okay? As long as those two people, the contracting parties, are the only people affected. And he finishes with this here. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. Okay, so here again, you've got this question of the proper relationship between the preferences of the majority and the preferences of a minority. And he says, he's saying majorities should not compel minorities to live the way that they think is best. They should let those minorities, people with minority preferences, those people should have the freedom to pursue other people with similar preferences to them and not have the preferences of the majority imposed on them. But notice the justification. Mankind are greater gainers. Right? This is a utilitarian justification. So you get a principle of respect for the autonomy of rational beings here, right? Very much like Kant, or very much like contemporary Kantians anyway. Right? The idea is you should respect rational human beings' ability to make their own decisions, right? And they are making decisions that are respectful, that we don't need to interfere with, as long as they're treating each other as ends in themselves, right? As long as they're engaging each other's rational faculties by contracting with each other instead of forcing each other to do stuff. And so you get a very similar kind of ethic here to the one that we saw most contemporary Kantians would endorse, but for very, very different reasons. And we saw that in Kant and in Kant. I mean, this is the big divide in ethics, in normative ethics. Okay, some people are consequentialists. They think that what makes certain actions right or wrong ultimately is their consequences. Some people are deontologists. They think that there are some principles that we have to follow regardless of their consequences. Okay, and I didn't give you the argument in Kant, but Kant thinks that he can show that the categorical imperative is one of those. And he thinks that there are reasons that we have to treat human beings as ends in themselves, or rational beings as ends in themselves, that have nothing to do with the consequences. Whereas consequentialists like Mill, like all utilitarians, but also like Mill, think that ultimately what justifies any principle or any action is its consequences. And so although they can agree that we should treat other human beings as ends in themselves, we should not force them to do stuff when they don't want to do it, even if it doesn't harm anybody, the ultimate justification is going to be a utilitarian one. It's going to be a consequentialist one. It's going to have to do with the greater good. Okay, so again, very similar ethic to what you find in contemporary Kantians, right? A consent-based ethic, but for very different reasons. It's a very different justification. So what is sort of the argument that comes out of this? What is the structure of Mill's thinking here? Well, the first premise is basically the utilitarian principle, right? The principle of utility, which is that the social norms that we ought to enact are the ones that would produce the greatest happiness overall, right? This simply follows from what we saw last time. Then the second premise that he seems to be relying on here is, well, individuals know best what's going to bring them happiness, right? I know better than some guy in the government or even some panel in the government, some group, what is going to bring me happiness. And then add to this the third premise. Well, if that's true, and if it's true that individuals know best what will bring them happiness, then the social norms that will produce the most happiness are the ones that give those individuals themselves the most freedom to pursue their preferences. That seems to be the general structure of Mill's argument. And this is a very common way to argue among liberals. Okay, it's not that you have infallible knowledge of your happiness. Sometimes you'll be wrong, but generally speaking, you know better than strangers who've never met you in the government or whatever, what is in your own good. And even when you're wrong, well, you're in a better position to figure it out than somebody who's never met you, right? If you're wrong about what's in your own good and you enter into some agreement with somebody and it turns out that it's not in your own good, well, you're the person who is best placed to figure that out and to get out of that agreement, right? Nobody else is better placed than you. And so things will be better right? Whether we're talking about economic freedom, whether we're talking about your sexual life, whether we're talking about the kinds of things you can discuss, like free speech, whatever, things will be better if we just let people pursue their preferences to the maximal degree that's possible without harming other people. Um, that is what is going to lead to the greater good. Okay, and so the conclusion that he derives here is, well, the social norms that we should enact, right, the ones that we should put in place, I should say here, the political and the social norms, right, in both scenarios, um, are the ones that give individuals the most freedom to pursue their preferences. And that's the general structure of his argument. And so what you get is an ethic of consent. Okay? We should give people, both politically speaking, like we should give them the legal right, and socially speaking, we should socially tolerate um, whatever people do with their freedom to contract with each other. Okay? So we should, even if we disagree, even if we think it's harmful to them, whatever, even if it's against our moral principles, we should at least tolerate those things, let them do it. So what this means is, for Mill, consent is sufficient for social and political permissibility. So consent is enough. That the fact that you and somebody else consents, right? It's actually a bit more complicated than just consent, as we've seen. It's got to be rational. It's got to be uncoerced, undeceived, But consent understood that way, if two people consent, if you and somebody else consent in that way, then it's none of the government's business what the two of you do if it affects nobody else. And similarly, if you and somebody else consents in that way, then it's none of society's business to try to stop you, as long as, again, it doesn't hurt anybody else. So the idea behind this kind of liberal ethic of consent is simply to let people contract freely to try to pursue what they think is in their interests. So one thing that Mill emphasizes in On Liberty, and that other liberals and other utilitarians after him emphasize, is that experiments in living can be socially useful. And so attempts to live outside the norm, attempts to live in ways that are outside the norm, can be socially useful. So early in the 20th century, okay, after Mill, in a period that'll be closer to what we're talking about next time, there were some utilitarian thinkers like Bertrand Russell who advocated for certain experiments in living with regard to sex and relationships as well. And so for a lot of history, temporary partnerships were impermissible. Nobody had them. Like if you've had a girlfriend or boyfriend already at your age, which is likely, and you've broken up, well, that was a temporary romantic relationship. If you had sex with them, that was a temporary sexual relationship. Those didn't really happen before, right? So in the medieval period, you have sex with somebody. Well, now you're married. Okay. Now you're going to have to get married. And that, of course, is going to last forever. It's a sacrament created by God. We can't destroy it. We can't take it apart. And so you're with them forever. And often this happened quite early on in somebody's life, right? It was very common for most of Western history for girls, for example, to be married off around 13, like around puberty, right? Certainly in their teens. Whereas now, in the 20th century, with this kind of liberal ethic in mind, people are saying, well, temporary partnerships is something that maybe people should experiment with. Right? People aren't necessarily ready to settle down with a partner when they're in their teens. But also, when they're in their teens, they start having sexual needs, making it difficult not to have relationships. And so maybe temporary partnerships are a good idea. This was completely foreign at the time. Not at all foreign to us, but at the time, very foreign. People start to advocate for the legal and social acceptability of same-sex relationships. This was, during the medieval period, not acceptable at all. It was a very good way to get yourself jailed or killed. Other experiments in living that might be socially useful, maybe experiments with things like polyamory, maybe experiments with things like open relationships. Why? Like, why would, from this perspective, experiments in living be maybe a good idea? Now, this doesn't mean everybody should try it, not at all. But the idea is, if you think this would be in your own good, right, if you think this would be right for you, then if you're right, it's going to increase your overall well-being. And also, if you're right, well, it can be instructive to others for whom it might also be right. Okay? For that minority of people for whom this relationship that's outside of the ordinary might be right. And then if it's wrong for you, right? If you try something out like this, you try an open relationship or something, and it turns out to be horribly hurtful and you regret it, okay, that's caused some harm and that's bad. But one thing that's good that's come out of it is you've learned that's not for you. So now you know better what you need, and others can learn from your mistakes. Right? So other people who thought like you that it might be good for them can look to your case and be like, okay, maybe not actually. Right? So from a utilitarian perspective, experiments in living can be quite beneficial. But if you are pretty sure that something's in your interest, it's going to be beneficial to everybody if you give it a try, because you might increase your own well-being, and also others can learn from your example. So there seems to be a fairly optimistic view of sex here. This is like the first person we've read who has maybe a more optimistic view of sex. The view, as I put last time, is well, sexual pleasure is just one of the many goods that are to be considered when figuring out which social norms to put in place and when figuring out how to live your life and that kind of thing, what kind of expectations to have of each other. And it doesn't seem to pose more problem than any other, right? Just as where economic activity is concerned, you should be free to just figure out what works for you, free to start a business, free to trade with anybody you want. Just as where church is concerned, it should be the same thing. You should figure out what you think your beliefs are and see if you can convince others, start a church or go to whatever church you prefer. So with your sexual preferences, you should be free to figure out what you think is in your good, sexually speaking or romantically speaking. And if they exist, find others who are like you. Again, as long as you're not harming anybody else. So there seems to be the idea, and certainly this comes out later in the 20th century, like a free market of lifestyles, if you will, right? Let people do what they will, and try to figure out what lifestyle works best for them, which one best satisfies their needs, and everybody will be better off for it. So that's everything that I want to tell you about Mill's utilitarianism and on liberty, and how on the basis of this kind of utilitarian normative ethical theory, he gets to this liberal political and social ethic. I guess this kind of idea that people should be free to contract with each other, to enter into any kind of agreement they want to, thinking that it's in their own good, as long as it doesn't harm anybody else than the people involved. Now what I'd like to do is move on to our analysis, which I think we'll get through fairly quickly. Again, I want to talk about sexual ethics, and I want to talk about sexual metaphysics. Most of this I've already kind of touched on, but I just want to make it a bit more explicit. Okay, so the first thing is that Mill's argument leads to a liberal sexual politics. So here I'm really talking about the political side of it. It's no business of the state, from Mill's perspective, to regulate what consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedrooms. Okay. Whatever you and your romantic or sexual partner or partners want to do in the privacy of your bedrooms is no business of the state. Again, this doesn't mean that it might not be a bad idea to do, okay? And people can try to dissuade you or whatever. But it's not the business of the law to punish you for doing it, because it doesn't harm anybody else than yourselves. This is a huge shift. Okay? This is an enormous shift. For most of the history we've been looking at, certainly starting in the Middle Ages, same-sex relations were not just socially frowned upon. They were, but not just socially frowned upon. They were illegal. Okay, they were illegal. It's only in past the mid-20th century, actually, that same-sex relations start to be socially tolerated and also politically tolerated. Actually, I think there are some places right now in the States where on the books there are still sodomy laws. They don't enforce them, but where, according to the law, anal sex is punishable. I'm fairly certain they still have some of those laws on the books, even though, again, nobody actually enforces them. And when you look at like the history of Canada, for example, This is exactly the justification that Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, gave when or when he enacted our more liberal sexual laws, or rather, when he took off right, our less liberal sexual laws. Right, what he said was, it's just no business of the state to regulate what consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedrooms. So what you get here, now you don't get this during Mill's time, by the way. Like it takes until the 20th century, as I've said. But this kind of reasoning, this kind of liberal view of politics has effects downstream in the 20th century, um, both on the political side, as I've just said, right? So laws regulating sexual activities get relaxed significantly, but also on the social side. Okay, so the other thing that you get here, beside a liberal sexual politics, is a liberal sexual ethics. So we as a society should tolerate sexual lifestyles that fall outside the norm, again, as long as everybody consents and as long as nobody besides them is affected. We can still criticize, we can still, try to dissuade, things like that. But Mill thinks we should not be trying to force people through various means of social coercion, right, by discrimination and things like that, to abandon lifestyles that don't affect anybody else but them. Another thing that changes with all this is I pointed out when we talked about Kant that in the modern period, people start to view marriage primarily as a contract. It's an agreement that two people enter into for their mutual benefit. This is, again, very different from how people understood marriage during the Middle Ages. Right? Marriage was thought to be a sacrament created by God. It's not something that individuals create. And also, its purpose is to raise children. It has a very definite purpose. But in the modern period, people see marriage increasingly as a contract, meaning it's a relationship you enter into, an agreement you enter into for your own good. And this kind of reasoning leads to much more liberal divorce laws as well. Right? If you enter into a contract for your own good and it turns out to be not your own good, well, it should be legally permissible for you to get out of that contract. Now, maybe we should build in, the terms for getting out of it. Because usually when you make a promise with somebody, you're supposed to keep it. And if it's an important promise that you build your whole life around, maybe there should be like conditions under which you're able to leave. Somebody has to pay somebody else money, divide the goods in certain ways, whatever. But in principle, you should be able to get out. Okay, so what you get on the basis, I mean, Mill himself, for feminist reasons, okay, because what you had during the 19th century was still fairly young girls entering into marriages that they then just could not get out of. Mill, for feminist reasons, with his wife Harriet Taylor, was a proponent of divorce. Right, he thought this would be in women's interests if they were able to leave partnerships that they entered into when they, weren't really able to make good decisions, and were then stuck in. All right, let's do the thing I always do with talking about what's permissible, what's obligatory, and what's impermissible. What kind of sexual ethic, or what does this sexual ethic look like? Well, imagine you've got this guy on his own, and he feels like masturbating. Or imagine that you've got this guy and this lady, and they're not married. Either they want to have a temporary partnership, or just like kind of a hookup after a party, or, they think they'll stay together forever, but they don't really want to get married. Or suppose you've got this guy and this guy, and same kind of thing. They just think they're going to have a temporary fling or some kind of a hookup, or, they love each other dearly and want to stay together forever, but they don't want to get married. Or even suppose that these three people think monogamy is not for them and they want to form a throuple and live in a hippie commune somewhere. Well, that's permissible. Okay, that is, again, socially and politically permissible. It might not be in their own good. All of these may or may not be in their own good, but it's permissible for them to figure that out. Okay, that's their business. As long as everybody consents, whatever they want to do is permissible, because there's this private sphere of non-interference, right? No government interference, no social interference. Although there's various ways in which we can try to reason with them or whatever, or see if their reasons are good, we cannot try to stop them either by physical force, the force of the law, or by the force of social coercion. Then, is anything obligatory? Well, suppose this guy and this guy have entered into some kind of sexual contract and they've agreed, well, we're not going to see anybody else. We're just going to have sex with each other. Or suppose that this guy and this lady have entered into this kind of contract. Or again, suppose that all three of them have entered into this kind of contract. Well, I guess we can talk about maybe some kind of an obligation to make good on your promises here, right? Such that if, one of them simply ceases to have sex with the other might think, okay, I'm not sure this contract works for me anymore. This arrangement works for me anymore. And they can talk it out. We can talk about here there being a certain amount of obligation, maybe. Okay, this might just come out of like following through with your contracts. I don't know. This is something that people might debate. But then what about what's impermissible? Well, again, it seems that the only things that are impermissible are going to be places or things where there's no rational consent, okay, or where there's a rational consent that is coerced or something like that. So, most utilitarians would still say, I mean, there's this, it's actually quite difficult to explain what is wrong about bestiality on utilitarian theory, and this is a source of controversy. But it seems like you might say that, well, here there's no possible rational consent. And so allowing for bestiality would allow for a lot of animal abuse, and so it should be impermissible. Another big thing that I haven't talked about yet at all, really, is now you're going to think, well, sex with people who are too young is going to be morally impermissible. Now, I don't want to say, I'm not claiming that before the modern period, people thought that pedophilia was fine. That's not true, speaking of young children. But before the modern period, it was quite common again for girls to get married in their teens. Whereas now, like I'm talking like young teens sometimes, right? Depends. But it was quite common. Usually as soon as a girl had reached puberty, it was thought, okay, well, she's ready to be married now. Whereas with this kind of liberal social ethic that you find both in contemporary Kantians and in contemporary utilitarians, right? In the dominant moral theories now, people tend to think, no, sex with people whose rational faculties are not developed enough yet is impermissible. They're not yet in a position to know what's in their good, and so cannot just be allowed to enter into whatever agreement, whatever contract they want to. And so these things, and also, of course, throw in rape, any form of manipulation, any form of deceit, right? Sexual activity that involves any of these things, those are all going to be impermissible. And they're going to be the only things that are thought to be impermissible, right? The only things where either the state or society is justified in intervening and saying, no, this can't happen, right? Punishing you if you do it, that kind of thing. And so during the modern period, again, this kind of reasoning, this utilitarian reasoning, Kantian reasoning, goes hand in hand with the feminist movement. Okay? Early feminists like Mill and his partner Harriet Taylor were concerned about consent laws as well. Okay, thought, well, because girls end up in marriages so early, they never get a chance to develop their rational faculties. They never get a chance to be equal with men in various kinds of ways, right? They never get a chance to get educated, seek out a job, vote, these kinds of things, because they get married off early on and never get an education. What we should do, these people thought, is not allow this to happen and give them the chance to develop their rational faculties and enter into contracts based on those rational faculties like men do. Okay, so this kind of utilitarian ethic, kind of Kantian ethic as well, goes hand in hand with various liberation movements, as I pointed out. Then finally, a couple words about sexual metaphysics. What you seem to get here, as I point out, is a fairly optimistic view of the human sexual impulse. Okay? Mill seems to depend on the assumption, on the premise, that leaving us to pursue our own preferences, including our sexual preferences, will make most of us better off. Okay? So that if you just leave everybody, all rational adults, to their own devices to figure out, what kinds of sexual agreements they want to enter into, everybody will be better off. But that, of course, assumes that the sexual instinct isn't much more problematic, right? It might be a little bit more problematic, but not much more problematic than our other drives, right? Than our drives for food and drink. In matters of food and drink, we assume, okay, well, we can let people make their own decisions about what they want to eat, what they want to drink, when they want to sleep, things like that. Um, and it seems that people like Mill, um, a lot of the people who came after Mill with this kind of reasoning as well, are taking it for granted that although the sexual instinct might be somewhat more problematic than these other drives, right? It might be more urgent, less controllable, maybe a little bit more likely to get us into trouble, like getting us to choose wrongly. Generally speaking, it's not so much more problematic that we need to step in and prevent people from acting on it. Okay. So as I put last time, sexual pleasure simply becomes one of the various goods to be traded off, right, on a utilitarian theory. One of the various goods to take into consideration in figuring out which norms are going to lead to uh, the greater good, right? The most happiness for the greatest number of people. Um, and of course, this is where, you know, there can be disagreement, right? So if you look at Freud, I point out last time, um, Freud doesn't have, I think, a very carefully worked out ethical theory. He wasn't a philosopher, but his general justification for why it's very important to repress the sexual instinct is a utilitarian one, more or less, right? He thinks that's what's going to be in the greater good. He thinks that it's in everybody's benefit if we impose a lot of restrictions on the sexual instinct. Um, and so what I want to point out here is utilitarianism as such is just a view about what makes actions right or wrong. Right? It's going to be right if it brings about the most happiness overall, wrong if it doesn't. And this is going to entail a view about what kinds of norms we should put in place. And what a utilitarian thinks we should do about the sexual impulse is presumably going to depend at least a little bit about what they think that impulse is like. Okay, if like Freud, you think that the sexual impulse is like this monstrous force that if left to its own devices will destroy society, then of course you might have a more restrictive sexual ethic. But if, as Mill seems to be assuming here, and as others after him seem to assume as well, like Bertrand Russell, who I mentioned earlier, um, if you think that really the sexual impulses, although it might be somewhat more problematic, not that much more problematic, then you might think, well, better off just leave individuals to figure out what they think is in their best interest, and that won't lead to a whole bunch of social harm. Okay, um, and so this is a place where it's possible to disagree, but certainly in Mill and in a lot of people who came after him, they have this relatively optimistic view where it's going to be in everybody's benefit if we let them choose whatever lifestyle they think fits them best. Okay, so that's everything about Mill. That's our topic on sexual consent. Here is, as always, a quick recap. According to Mill, as we've seen, social life should be organized around the harm principle. Coercive power, both of the state and of society, right? Both the legal power of the state to send in people to punish you or to fine you or whatever, and the various ways in which we can exercise social pressure on each other can only be used to prevent harm to others. And he defends this harm principle on utilitarian grounds. Given that people know the most about their own preferences, giving them the most freedom to pursue those preferences is what is going to produce the greatest happiness overall. And in sexual matters, this entails that consent, as long as it's, again, rational, unforced, undeceived, consent is sufficient for sexual activity to be politically and socially acceptable, right? For it to be tolerated politically and socially. Now, next time, we're going to move on to the 20th century and see some other people who also had, much more permissive sexual ethics in the 20th century, and talk about the concept of sexual repression. All right, I'll see you soon. Stick around for questions. Otherwise, bye.